The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in fire and gold, the last light of day burning against the horizon. Dust clung to the wind, swirling around the creaking wagon wheels as the Harper family pressed westward. The journey had been long, fraught with hardship, but James Harper had promised his wife, Abigail, and their 12-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, that beyond the mountains lay fertile land untouched by war. Ellie sat in the back of the wagon, legs curled beneath her, fingers tracing the worn cover of her mother's Bible. The scent of sunbake would mix with the musk of the oxen pulling their load. She tried to focus on the words her mother whispered in prayer, but the sound of her father's quiet conversation with the other men drifted back to her. They were nervous. Word had spread of raiders in the area. Cheyenne warriors angered by the settlers' slow invasion of their land. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. A hawk screamed overhead, circling, its wings cutting against the evening sky. The air held a strange weight, a silence deeper than usual. Her father's voice rose, urgent. Then came the first shot. A sharp crack split the stillness. In the next breath, the world exploded into chaos. The oxen bellowed, rearing against their yokes as a second shot rang out. Men shouted. Women screamed. The wagon jerked forward as her father yanked the reins, trying to steer them away from the gunfire. Ellie clutched the wooden frame, heart pounding, as shadows moved between the tall grass. An arrow struck the canvas above her head, piercing through with a sickening rip. The world narrowed to the thundering sound of hooves and gunfire. Smoke curled into the sky as one of the wagons ahead was set ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry wood. Ellie, her mother's hands gripped her shoulders, shaking her. Stay down, don't move. Her father was already outside, rifle in hand, shouting orders. The air smelled of burning wood and blood. Another arrow hit the wagon, this time embedding itself into Abigail's shoulder. She gasped, her grip tightening on Ellie before she collapsed against the wooden slats. Time slowed. The wagon lurched violently as one of the oxen went down, its massive body crashing to the earth, taking the vehicle with it. Ellie screamed as she was thrown backward, tumbling into the dust. The world became a blur of movement, shadows, fire, and the endless cries of the dying. She scrambled to her knees, coughing against the smoke. A hand reached for her. Her father, his face, streaked with sweat and dirt, twisted with desperation. Run. She shook her head. No, I can... Go. His rifle cracked, and an enemy fell. Ellie hesitated for one agonizing moment before turning and running, legs pumping against the uneven ground. The smell of death clung to the wind. Behind her, she heard the sound of her father's last shot. She didn't look back. The grass swallowed her, tall stalks whipping against her arms as she pushed forward. The gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the thrum of her own heartbeat. She ran until her legs burned, until her breath came in ragged gasps, until the world tilted and she collapsed onto the cold earth. Darkness pressed in. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. She didn't know. The night was alive with the sounds of the wild. An owl hooted somewhere above, its cry echoing through the trees. The wind carried distant howls, and she pressed herself into the earth, willing herself to become small, invisible. A rustling sound. Close. Too close. Ellie held her breath, fingers digging into the dirt. Something moved in the shadows. A figure, stepping between the trees, barely more than a silhouette against the moonlight. A warrior. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with dark paint streaked across his face. Feathers decorated his long, black hair, and his gaze, even in the dim light, burned with quiet intensity. He was older than the others she had seen, his stance not one of reckless aggression, but of patience, observation. Ellie trembled, but she didn't run. He didn't move closer, only studied her. His expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, he crouched, opening a small pouch at his waist. A water skin. He held it out to her, an offering. Ellie didn't understand. The men who had attacked the wagons had not been merciful. And yet here he was, kneeling before her, offering her something other than death. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw from smoke and dust. Every part of her body ached, exhaustion settling into her bones like lead. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. She had nothing left, With trembling fingers, she reached out and took the water. The warrior watched her in silence as she drank, the cool liquid easing the fire in her throat. When she was finished, he stood, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated. If she went with him, she would be walking into the unknown. But if she stayed, she would die here, alone in the dark, lost in a land that had already stolen everything from her. She took a breath, and then, with one last glance toward the distant, burning remains of the wagon train, she stepped forward. The warrior nodded once before turning, leading her into the shadows of the forest. She followed. Ellie moved through the dense underbrush, her small frame dwarfed by the towering trees that loomed overhead. The warrior led the way, his steps silent against the earth, his presence commanding yet strangely unthreatening. She kept her distance, cautious, uncertain. The ground beneath her bare feet was rough, scattered with twigs and stones that bit into her skin. But she said nothing. Complaints had no place here. The warrior's pace remained steady, unhurried. He did not speak, nor did he turn to see if she still followed. It was as if he already knew she had no choice. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying the sense of pine, damp earth, and a lingering, acrid memory of fire. The night stretched long and silent. She wanted to ask where they were going. She wanted to ask why he had not killed her like the others. But her throat felt tight, the words trapped beneath grief and exhaustion. So she walked, step by step, deeper into the unknown. Hours passed. Or maybe it was only minutes. Time felt strange and wild. When they finally emerged into a clearing, the moon had begun its descent. A small camp rested beneath the shadow of a rocky outcrop. A handful of figures moved around a low burning fire, their faces turned toward the approaching warrior. The murmur of voices faded as they saw her. A boy, no older than 16, rose from his seat, his muscles tense beneath the glow of the flames. His gaze landed on her, sharp with suspicion. His features were similar to the warrior's, but his expression held none of the patience. "Why is she here?" His voice was quiet, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. The warrior did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing Ellie to be seen in full light. She felt their eyes on her, the men, the women, the children who watched from the edges of the camp. Their expressions were unreadable. She was left behind. The warrior finally said. The boy took a step closer, his jaw tight. "She is one of them." The warrior met his gaze, calm, unshaken. "She is a child." The boy's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. His hands curled into fists before he turned on his heel, walking away. The warrior motioned toward the fire, gesturing for her to sit. Ellie hesitated, then obeyed, lowering herself onto the cold earth. A woman approached, older than the others, her dark eyes unreadable as she set down a small wooden bowl. Stew. The scent filled Ellie's nose, meat, herbs, something rich and unfamiliar. Her stomach clenched in hunger, but she made no move to eat. The warrior sat across from her, his expression as steady as ever. "You must eat," he said. His voice was deep, quiet. Ellie met his gaze. "Why did you bring me here?" The warrior did not answer right away. He took a small piece of meat from his own bowl, eating it before speaking. "Because you were alone." Her fingers tightened around the rim of the bowl. "You killed them." "No." His response was simple, absolute. There was no anger in it, no defense. Just truth. She swallowed hard, looking away. The camp was silent. She could feel the weight of the people's stares, their uncertainty. She was an intruder here. She did not belong. The stew in her hands grew colder. The days passed slowly. Ellie did not speak much, nor did anyone speak to her. The women of the camp kept their distance. The children watched her with cautious curiosity. The men, especially the boy, treated her presence like an open wound. But she was not mistreated. She was given food, water, and space to sleep beneath a lean-to, away from the others. She spent most of her time watching. The people here were unlike the settlers she had known. They moved with purpose, with quiet understanding of the land. There was laughter, too, though not in excess. She saw the way the warriors trained, how the elders sat in deep conversation, how the mothers carried their infants on their backs, whispering words she could not understand. They were a world away from everything she had lost. But grief was a shadow that did not lift easily. At night, when the camp had fallen into slumber, Ellie curled on herself, clutching the small silver locket that still hung around her neck. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. The ache in her chest was relentless, an ever-present weight. One evening, as she sat alone, staring into the fire's flickering glow, the warrior approached. He lowered himself beside her, setting a small piece of wood and a carving knife between them. She glanced at it, confused. He picked up his own piece of wood, his knife gliding smoothly across its surface. Carving teaches patience. Ellie hesitated. Try. Her fingers trembled as she took the knife, though it felt rough beneath her palm, unshaped, unfamiliar. She mimicked his movements, pressing the blade against the grain. The first cut was uneven, clumsy, but she kept going. Time slipped by. The warrior did not speak, nor did he correct her mistakes. He only carved beside her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. She did not thank him, but she kept a small, misshapen piece of wood when she left. The boy, Cheyenne, she had learned, was the only one who did not soften toward her. He glared when she passed, his body always tense. His words clipped when he was forced to speak to her. One afternoon, she found him near the river's edge, sharpening the tip of a spear. "Why do you hate me?" she asked. Cheyenne's jaw tightened. "Because my mother was killed by settlers, like yours were killed by my people." His words struck like a stone. Ellie's fingers curled at her sides. "My father brought you here," he continued, voice low, "but that does not mean you belong." She turned away before he could see the sting in her expression. The days grew colder. The trees shed their leaves, painting the ground in amber and rust. Ellie's hands grew stronger, her steps more certain. The warrior, Dakota, she had learned, taught her to listen to the land, to tell the difference between the rustling of wind and the movement of something alive, to find tracks in the mud, to tell which berries were safe and which were not. One afternoon, as she wandered near the edge of the woods, a low growl stopped her in her tracks. She turned slowly. A wolf. It was young, its ribs visible beneath its thick coat. But hunger made creatures bold. Ellie did not move. The wolf bared its teeth, inching closer. She knew she should run, but she also knew she could not outrun it. A second growl split the air, but this time it did not come from the wolf. Dakota stepped between them, spear in hand. His eyes never left the animal. Ellie held her breath. The wolf hesitated, nostrils flaring. Then, with a sharp flick of its tail, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The tension in Ellie's chest finally released. Dakota glanced at her. "You did not run." She swallowed hard. "I couldn't." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "You are learning." That night, as she sat by the fire, Cheyenne's gaze lingered on her longer than before. She did not know if it was respect or resentment. Perhaps both. The wind carried the scent of snow, sharp and biting, as it swept down from the mountains. The first frost had settled over the land, painting the grasses in brittle white, and the once verdant forest now stood skeletal, bare branches reaching skyward like fingers grasping for something lost. Ellie pulled her furs tighter around her shoulders, her breath curling in the cold air. She had learned to endure the seasons as the Cheyenne did, without complaint, without expectation of mercy from the land. Dakota moved ahead, his silent steps leaving barely a trace in the frost-covered earth. Cheyenne followed, his spear strapped across his back, his expression unreadable as always. Ellie brought up the rear, her knife secured at her waist, her bow slung across her shoulder. They were scouting, watching the horizon for signs of movement. The world felt different these past few weeks, more watchful, more dangerous. The attacks had begun in the dead of night. Bounty hunters, settlers emboldened by rumors of retribution, strangers who came with fire and steel, seeking revenge for the blood spilled on both sides. The Cheyenne had moved camp twice already, retreating deeper into the wilderness, but they were running out of places to hide. Ellie's fingers brushed the worn leather of her quiver. She had become something else in these months, no longer just a girl who had been taken in, No longer a settler child lost in the wild. She had become something in between, and she knew, deep in her bones, that neither side would accept her fully. A crow cawed overhead, its wings beating against the pale sky. Dakota raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. Ellie obeyed without question. Footprints. Fresh. Dakota crouched, brushing his fingers over the disturbed frost. His jaw tightened. Men, he murmured. 5. Horses. Chayton's grip on his spear shifted. They are close. Ellie swallowed. She could see it now. The indentations in the earth, the pattern of hooves leading toward the valley below. The land stretched wide there, open and exposed. If the bounty hunters were setting a trap, it would be there. Dakota stood. We return. Ellie nodded, but Chayton hesitated. His gaze locked on the horizon. She knew what he was thinking. They were tired of running, tired of hiding. She was too. That night, the council gathered. The elders spoke in low, urgent voices, their faces lined with worry. Dakota listened, his expression unreadable, while Chayton sat with his arms crossed, silent but brimming with unspoken rage. Ellie stayed at the edge of the gathering, listening. They will not stop, one of the warriors said. They will follow us into mountains if they must. We should leave, another murmured, before more are lost. Chayton scoffed. And where will we go? There is no land left that is not claimed by steel and gunpowder. A hush fell over the group. No one had an answer. Then Dakota spoke. We will not leave, but we will not die in our sleep, either. Ellie's pulse quickened. There was something final in his tone. The decision was made. They would not flee again. That night, she sat near the fire, running her fingers over the carvings she had made in the wood Dakota had given her weeks ago. The shapes were smoother now, the edges worn down by her touch. You should go. Chayton's voice came from behind her. She turned. He was staring at the fire, his expression unreadable. Ellie frowned. What? You should go, he repeated. Run before they come. Her grip tightened on the wood. I'm not leaving. His gaze snapped to hers. This is not your fight. Ellie met his glare, unflinching. It is now. Chayton exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't understand. She rose to her feet, stepping closer. I understand more than you think. For a long moment, they just stood there, the fire crackling between them. Then, without another word, Chayton turned and walked away. The first attack came just before dawn. Ellie woke to the sound of hooves pounding against the frozen ground, to the crack of gunfire and the sharp cries of the wounded. She grabbed her bow and ran, heart hammering in her chest. Shadows moved between the trees. Men with rifles, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. She took cover behind a fallen log, knocking an arrow. Her hands were steady, her breath even. She waited. Then, as one of the bounty hunters stepped into the open, she let the arrow fly. It struck true. The man staggered, his rifle falling from his grasp. Ellie didn't have time to see if he got back up. Another shot rang out, the bullet striking the tree inches from her head. She dropped low, moving fast, her heart pounding. Across the clearing, Dakota fought with quiet efficiency, his tomahawk cutting through the chaos. Chayton was a storm of movement, his spear flashing in the firelight. But they were outnumbered. Ellie's breath caught as she spotted him, Ezekiel Crow. He sat atop a dark horse, watching the battle unfold with calm, calculated stare. He wasn't here for war. He was here for something specific. Her. She knew at the moment his gaze landed on her. Then, before she could react, he was moving. His horse thundered toward her. She turned to run, but it was too late. A rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her off her feet. The world spun. Then pain, sharp and sudden, flared through her ribs as she hit the ground. The breath was stolen from her lungs. Crow loomed over her, his revolver pointed at her head. You've been a hard one to track, girl, he drawled. Thought for sure you'd be dead by now. Ellie gritted her teeth, refusing to look away. His lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. Dakota's little pet. Bet he thinks you belong with him now, don't he? A flicker of movement. Then, before Crow could react, Dakota was there, The fight was brutal. Crow was fast, but Dakota was faster. The two men crashed together, blades flashing, fists colliding with bone. Ellie scrambled back, her vision swimming. Then a gunshot. The sound was deafening. Dakota staggered. Ellie's breath caught. Crow grinned. "Not so tough now, are you, old man?" Dakota didn't fall. Instead, he lunged. The knife found its mark. Crow's eyes widened. He choked on his own breath, the smile vanishing from his face. Then he collapsed. Silence. Ellie crawled to Dakota's side, pressing her hands against the wound on his side. His fingers brushed her arm. "It is nothing," he murmured. She knew it was a lie, but the battle was over, and they had won. The wind howled across the valley, carrying the scent of blood and gunpowder. The echoes of battle still lingered, the ground littered with bodies, some belonging to men who had come for vengeance, others to warriors who had given their lives to defend their home. The sky, once painted in streaks of pale dawn, had darkened with thick storm clouds, the promise of rain heavy in the air. Ellie knelt beside Dakota, pressing her trembling hands against his wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and slick, pooling into the dirt beneath him. His face was pale, his breast shallow, but his eyes remained steady, unyielding. "You need to hold on," she whispered, her voice raw with desperation. Dakota exhaled slowly, his hand reaching up, fingers grazing the edge of her jaw. "You are strong, little one." She shook her head, blinking back the tears that burned her eyes. "Don't say it like that. You're going to be fine. We just need to get you back to the village." Behind her, Cheyenne stood rigid, his face carved from stone, but his hands trembled at his sides. He had lost warriors today, brothers, friends. The weight of it settled in his eyes, dark and unreadable. Yet he knelt beside his father, gripping his wrist with quiet reverence. "We must move," he said, though his voice was hoarse. "More will come." Ellie swallowed hard, nodding. The enemy had been scattered, their leader slain, but Crow's men had not been the only ones who sought vengeance. More bounty hunters would come, more settlers who saw the Cheyenne as nothing more than obstacles in their path westward. Cheyenne helped Dakota to his feet, bearing his weight without hesitation. Ellie stayed close, her heart hammering in her chest as they made their way back toward the camp. The walk was slow, agonizing, but every step forward meant survival. By the time they arrived, the village was a ghost of what it had been. Many of the lodges still stood, but the damage had been done. The wounded were being tended to, the dead prepared for burial. Children clung to their mothers, silent, wide-eyed with grief. Ellie had seen death before. She had watched her family fall, heard the sound of bullets tearing through flesh. But this was different. These were people she had come to know, to care for. They were her people now. Dakota was taken to the healer's lodge, and Ellie lingered outside, pacing, her hands still stained with his blood. Cheyenne stood nearby, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "You fought well today," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Ellie looked up at him, surprised. His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You're not the same girl we found in the woods." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "No, I'm not." Cheyenne nodded once, as if that was all that needed to be said, then turned and disappeared into the village. The storm broke that night. Rain fell in heavy sheets, washing away the blood, cleansing the earth. Ellie sat outside the healer's lodge, listening to the steady patter against the roof. She hadn't been able to sleep, too afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake to find Dakota gone. But as dawn broke through the lingering mist, the healer emerged, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "He will live," she said simply. Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, pressing a hand against her chest as relief flooded through her. Days passed. The wounded healed, the dead were honored, and the village slowly began to mend. But the air was different now. There was no illusion of safety, no false hope that they could remain here forever. The settlers would keep coming. The war was not over. Dakota recovered slowly, though he refused to rest as much as he should have. Ellie stayed by his side when she could, watching, listening, learning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Takota turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You have a choice to make, little one." Ellie stiffened, the weight of his words settling over her. "You are not a child of my blood, but you are one of us. You have learned our ways, fought beside us, but your heart will always carry the past." She swallowed, her throat tight. "I don't know where I belong." Takota's gaze softened. "Belonging is not always about where you were born. It is about where you choose to stand." She thought of her parents, of the life that had been taken from her, the home that no longer existed. She thought of the village, of the people who had once seen her as an outsider, but now regarded her as something more. She thought of Cheyenne, his silent acceptance, his reluctant respect. She had been torn between two worlds for so long. But now she knew. Ellie lifted her chin, meeting Takota's gaze with unwavering certainty. "I choose here." Takota smiled, a rare, quiet thing, and as the stars emerged above them, she felt, for the first time since she had lost everything, that she had found something new, a home, not one of blood, but of choice, of survival, of love.